I'm going to demonstrate how to add a flat peyote stitch bail to the top of edging that you might find on bead embroidery. The edging here is essentially a brick stitch, and the thread path goes straight up and down away from the stone, and the peyote stitch is a stitch that has the thread path going left to right, and will essentially make that transition from the two thread path directions. We'll make a long strip of peyote stitch, and then we'll fold it up or fold it down over itself until you get a little circular tube that you can then put your cord through. There's two things that are worth demonstrating. It's the transition into peyote stitch, and then it's how to sew it up at the end and tie it off. Okay, so we'll get started. I apologize in advance, my beads are a little bit shiny, so hopefully you guys will be able to follow along with what I'm doing here. So this bead is a 11 round, and that's the same bead that is on my edging. I'm going to call the edge beads, I'm going to call the edging edge beads, and I'm going to call these that are going into the bail, I'll call those bail beads. My peyote stitch is going to be 6 beads wide, and the first thing you have to do is determine where the center of your pendant is and determine where you're going to place it. That way, if you pay attention to it, you won't end up with your bail a little bit off to the side so that it's crooked. And when you lay these down, there's 6 beads. They might not lay exactly over 6 beads. It might lay over 4 or 5. It could lay over 6 beads. Kind of have to figure that out, and you want to be exiting the first edge bead for that width of where those would go. And when you tack it down into the most reasonable place. Like I said, it could be the 4th bead, the 5th bead, the 6th bead. It's going to be somewhere in there. But if you lay it down nice and evenly like this, you'll have an obvious answer of where you should tack it down. So let's see, if I set it down, I'm going to tack down right here, right next to it. And when I tack it down, all I'm doing is going down through that first, or that appropriate edge bead. See, so it tacks it into place. And then I take another look at it, and I say to myself, is it even? If that's where my bail is that where I want it? Is it too far to the left or too far to the right? If you don't like the placement, then you'll have to take these off and get yourself into the correct first edge bead. Okay, so the next thing we have to do is anchor this, because this is kind of floppy, and if we start stitching off of that, it won't be very secure. So we'll go up through an edge bead, through a couple bail beads, down through an edge bead, up through an edge bead, through a couple bail beads, etc., so that it gets anchored. And it doesn't really matter how you weave in and out, as long as you're exiting that very first bail bead. Okay, so I am already down here, so I'm going to go up the very next edge bead. Just the edge bead. And then I take a look at where my thread is and where do I want to go through the beads, the bail beads. So let's go through 2, just because. And then I'll go down through the closest edge bead. Up through the neighboring edge bead, obviously working my way back towards the beginning of my first row of peyote stitch. There we go. And now I'm in a good position to just go ahead and exit that first bead. So we have a nice row of a nice anchored base row. So my thread path on these top beads is going left to right instead of the edge beads that go up and down, and I'm ready to start my peyote stitch. Your first row or two are going to be kind of strange, and your beads might want to pull towards the right if you've been following me exactly here. But just keep in mind that whenever you do seed beading, the first couple rows are always a little funky, and the more you do, the more they lock into place. Just focus on your tension and keeping them in the correct position. So the way we start with our flat peyote stitch is to pick a bead up on our needle, and this is bead number 1 of our base row. We're going to skip bead number 1, but we are going to travel through bead number 2. Now obviously we're going back into the bail because we're creating a row. Your first 2 beads should sit right up on top of one another. Okay, then we're going to pick up another bead. This time we're going to skip, we're coming out of bead number 2. We're going to skip bead number 3 and we're going to travel through bead number 4. And I like to hold on to my beads as I pull them through so they kind of maintain their position. So you can see you've got a stack on your first set of beads, then you skip bead number 2, and then a stack on top of your third bead. Okay, you're only adding, it's a 6 bead row, so you're adding 3 beads, 3 beads in each direction, and they alternate. It's like a brick pattern, so you're only doing 3 at a time, each 3 one way and 3 the next way. Okay, so I have a bead on my thread. I'm going to skip bead number 5. We were exiting bead number 4, skip bead 5, and go through bead 6, and then pull it nice and snug, so that that bead sits atop bead number 5. And part of the reason I'm holding it snug is if I don't, then these will really pull over to the right, and I kind of want to keep it standing up straight. All right, so my 6th bead, which is a little bit kind of leaning over there, has a gap right here, and then there's a gap in between these, and there's a gap in between those. When we continue with our peyote stitch, essentially we're just filling in the gaps for the subsequent rows. So I'm going to pick up a bead. Let's make sure my tension is good to start. And I'm just going to go in the opposite direction through that raised bead, just the one. Okay, and so now they're starting to lock in together. So again, I'm going to take a bead, fill in this gap, fill in this gap by threading through this one, take a bead, fill in the next gap by going through the last one. Pick up a bead, go through the next raised bead, pick up a bead, and go through that last raised bead. And you can see it's actually starting to create some fabric here. Okay, I'll do a couple more rows. Now the raised beads are not quite so obvious, but every other bead is sticking up a little bit. And essentially you're doing the same thing you did at the beginning. We're exiting here, we picked up a bead, we're skipping bead number 1, and we're going to travel through bead number 2. Pick up a bead, skip that lowered one, and go through the raised one. Pick up a bead, skip the lowered one, go through that very last one. Okay. I do need to work on my tension a little bit just to make sure everything's laying in the proper spot. And again, if I can kind of maintain it, I will be able to work my way back and forth, and it should work out as we go. The more stuff we add to it, the better it all falls into place. Picking up a bead, skip the gap, go through the raised bead. Also, I want you to notice that whenever I pull my thread, first of all, I'm kind of holding my beads together with my thumb and forefinger, but I'm also pulling my thread in the direction that it's exiting the bead. So I'm not making tension by pulling up, pulling backwards, or down. If my thread's exiting to the left, I'm going to pull my bead to the left, and that seems to just get everything else happy and in working order. You're not pulling up anything apart. You're just cinching up what you're already working on. Okay, So let's do a little bit more of that until we get a good strip that when it folds over, it's the size that we want it to be. Okay, so I'm pretty sure I've finished the flat peyote stitch that I want to do. And when you're sewing up in this fashion, if you started your row on the left, you want to end on the left. And that way you have a relationship between the raised beads on this end and the raised beads on your first row. They should, when you fold it over, you want them to be able to lock into place because we're going to weave back and forth from this row to that row. I like to do it on the back side. So if this is what I'm calling the last row, and down here this is what I'll call the base row. It's not the edging, but it's the bottom beads of the peyote stitch that we worked on at the very beginning. So the first thing I'm going to do is send my needle through the first bead of the base row and then get that to flop over. Then I'm going to, and you might not be able to see this with the darkness of the ultra suede and the beads, so I'll try to explain it as I go. So I went through the first bead of the base row, and then I want to go through the second bead of the end row, the last row you put on your strip of peyote stitch. And then I want to go through the third bead, 2, 3, of the base row. And then next, 1, 2, 3, the fourth bead of the end row. And then the fifth bead in the base row. And then the sixth bead of the end row. Where are you? Now just to lock that last bead in place, we're going to come the opposite direction through the first bead of the base row. So essentially you're attached now. Your bail is attached on there. It might be a little floppy, so what I like to do is just take a little bit of time to weave back and forth in and out and even into your edge beads a little bit. This is where you're going to get the most tension and pressure on your pendant because that's where your cord lies. And so the more you can weave in and out and kind of reinforce it, the better off you're going to be. So I'm going to do that off camera and then we'll come back and I'll show you how to tie it off. Okay, so I reinforced this and I like it a lot better. It's not so floppy. It's a little bit big, so it's going to flop around a little bit. But you can see it's a nice size. You'll get a nice big cord through there if you want. And what I essentially did was weave through that final row where I sewed up the front or the end beads to the base beads, more or less through there, and then I went back and forth through my edge beads and into the peyote stitch a little bit more, just so that I feel like it's attached well. I happen to be exiting a bead in the bail right here. Doesn't matter too much where you're exiting. What I want to do, this is my preferred method of tying off. There's a lot of different ways you can do it. But what I would like to do is get my thread and needle into a spot where I have my peyote stitch over here. You can tie off in your back stitch rows if you want, or in your edging, or even right here, but I think when you get up into the bezel of your cabochon, or somewhere where the beadwork is tight, you're going to have a better chance of hiding your knot. So I'm going down through the nearest edge bead. And again, when you're traveling through your work, you want to make sure that you're not skipping any beads because you don't want to show your thread. And I'm going to go into some of that beadwork. I'm in the gold row now. Now I'm going to go into this copper row. And again, being very careful to go into the nearest bead because I don't want to show any thread. Now I think I had some other threads in these 15s, so it's a little tight. But it went through, which is good. Okay, and now I'm right in this row. I want to get into one of these 11s where I have some peyote stitching. Again, I just like to do it where the beadwork is nice and tight. Okay, I don't know if you can see, but I am now in this peyote stitch with these 11s right up against my stone. Wherever your thread is coming out, you want to use your needle to pick up some of the cross threads that already exist. See how I'm kind of grabbed on to some of that other threads. And I'm going to pull it through in order to make a little loop, but I'm not going to pull it all the way through. With this loop that I've got here, I'm going to go through it once. And don't pull it tight, just kind of tidy it up, and then go through it a second time in the same direction. That's a surgeon's knot, and when you pull tight and down, that knot should sink right into place. I don't want to cut it off right there because it's too close to the knot. I might jeopardize the knot that I've made. So I will continue through 2 or 3 more beads just to hide the tail. Whoops, my needle came off. Okay, I have my needle rethreaded. I don't have much thread to work with here. So I just tied my knot right there, and instead of cutting it right away, I'm going to go through a couple more beads that are right next to that knot. And what I'm doing here is I'm hiding the tail. Now when I trim it, I don't have to worry about jeopardizing the knot. Okay, so there we go. We've got a peyote stitch bail attached to the edging of our bead embroidered work.